Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about the pros and cons of laptop use in the law school classroom. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Allison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about using laptops and other technology in law school, when to use them and when to leave them at home, because this is actually not as straightforward as it might seem. I mean, it might seem to be a foregone conclusion that, of course, you're going to bring your laptop to school and take notes. I mean, certainly I did that in every class I went to.
Me too.
Although I will say the one time I took a class in the architecture school, no one had a laptop, and they looked at me like I was really weird when I brought mine out. And I was like, oh, everybody doesn't bring a laptop to class and take notes all the time. But, new research suggests that this technology might not actually make you a better law student, but a worse one. So let's talk about some pros and cons. Lee, what are the pros of using a laptop?
All right. So I think a lot of people find the pros of using a laptop to be that you can type faster than you can write. I think a lot of people feel like they can basically transcribe the class lecture when they're typing, when you can't do that when you're writing. A lot of people justify laptop use because things are easier to read, because some of our handwriting can be a little sketchy at times. Mm-hmm. Some people like to be able to move things around, copy and paste, have that flexibility in a note-taking document, which you don't necessarily have if you're working on paper. Some people like that you can have multiple windows or other information open to help with the class discussion. So if you can look up an answer or look something up, which you can't do if you don't have a laptop. But it kind of turns out that many of these pros don't actually lead to increased retention or learning.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, I was like, I loved having multiple windows open. We'd have a chat room going with 20 or 30 people in the class, and then people would randomly bust out laughing for no apparent reason, which really confused the professor. Were we focused on the lecture? Mm-hmm. No.
Right, exactly.
It made it more entertaining. Was I getting more out of the class? Probably not.
Yeah. So even outside of just how distracted people are with their laptops and the internet as a whole, which we'll get to in a bit, it turns out, based on some research done by some scientists named Pam Mueller and Daniel Oppenheimer, that I believe are out of Princeton, they did a bunch of research that actually demonstrates that students who write out their notes on paper actually learn more. Wah, wah. For all of us who love our laptops. Wah, wah. Yeah. So they started by doing 3 different experiments. The researchers had students take notes in the classroom setting and then tested students on their memory for factual detail, conceptual understanding of the material, and their ability to synthesize and generalize the information. So half of the students took notes on a laptop and the other half did by hand. Now, it turns out that the laptop note takers took more notes, not surprising, right? But those who wrote out their notes by hand had a stronger conceptual understanding and were more successful in applying and integrating the material than those who took notes with their laptops. I know, everybody's sad, right? I can feel like a sigh because everybody wants to be able to use their laptops in class, but it does turn out that when you take notes by hand, it requires different types of cognitive processing than typing. It might be slower and more cumbersome, but it's actually a good thing that you can't write down everything that happens in a lecture.
Yeah, I remember in one of my first year classes, this girl sat beside me, and we unfortunately were stuck with the seats that we got the first day. And she literally transcribed every word that was said. And it drove me completely crazy, but it also just made me think, like, what are you, like, you're not even paying attention here.
Right.
You're just writing stuff down. And if she got called on, she basically had no clue what was going on most of the time and couldn't answer the questions. So So I definitely believe this. I think it's just is a different form of processing information. If you're doing it by hand, you're probably going to listen more. You're probably going to think more about what you need to write down because you can't just type everything, So when you're doing that, you're probably digesting, summarizing the information. I know for me, it would probably be, had I taken notes by hand in class, it probably would have been helpful because I could have drawn, arrows between things or linked up concepts and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that, one of the things that a lot of us don't think about, especially because technology is so prevalent in our world, is how many kind of absent-minded things we do on technology. I think if everybody took a moment, we could think of an email that we wrote that we don't remember writing because we did it so fast, or a text message we don't remember sending. And that's not just because you might be like drunk texting or doing something like that, which is, which hopefully you're not like drunk note taking in your law school class, but
you may have other issues if that's the case.
Yes, it's true. I'm sure it happens. But technology allows us to do a lot of things in a very absent-minded way. And I think when we're thinking about class time, you really want to evaluate what happens when you take notes by hand. You are forced to listen more. You're forced to digest and summarize information so you can succinctly capture what happened in class. Your brain is working harder.
It's almost like your brain has to work harder.
Yeah. I mean, you're asking your brain to do extra processing and to stay focused, which is also going to help in retention. Now, somebody who's typing, and we've all been there, can produce a written record of a lecture without processing any additional meaning. When you're just when you're transcribing something, you're not synthesizing, you're not mentally working those muscles to understand what is being said. You're just listening and spitting things out on the page. And I think that that's a very important difference when you think about the learning that you're trying to do during class time.
Right. I think that, I remember from when I was a clerk in a district court and someone literally is there transcribing. You have the court transcriptionist who's doing shorthand, taking down exactly what's being said. And it was fascinating because my co-clerk and I were there, and we're sitting there, and, we were not allowed to have laptops, obviously, we're in court. And so we would just be sitting there watching what was going on, maybe making some notes occasionally. Frankly, we didn't even make that many notes most of the time. But we could go back and do an analysis of what did you think of this argument? What did you think of that? What did you think of this? But if you talk to the court reporter, she was like, I have no idea what was going on. I was just writing it down.
Right. Their job is completely different. Their job is to just listen and produce a record, not to think thoughtfully about what's happening.
Right. And if you asked her something like, what did you think about that argument? She's like, I don't know. I don't even remember what you're talking about.
Right. Because her brains was tasked with something completely different. I think we often forget that in a law school classroom setting, and most of these studies are not done in law schools, they're done in undergrad campuses, but I still think that, it still applies to a type of learning, that you want to be as engaged as possible to get the most out of a lecture. And transcribing reduces engagement, and then it's going to make it much harder for you to follow what's being done in class, think about it, and then it turns out retain that information.
Right, and I would argue it probably even applies more in a law school setting where you're using the Socratic method. Because frankly, there's a lot of discussion going on that you don't really need to be writing down most of the time.
Yeah.
You're looking for those key nuggets. It's just like reading a case. The case may be 8 pages and then it has 1 or 2 points of law, and those points of law are really what you're looking for.
Yeah.
So, in a Socratic type method, at least arguably in an undergraduate lecture, somebody might have prepared a lecture where you actually need to retain all of the information that they're giving you. But that's really not the case in a law school classroom. The point of law school classes really are to explore different options and learn how to make arguments and learn how to do analysis. And if you're just transcribing that, and I think sometimes people think, I'll just write it all down and then I'll read it later and figure out what's important. But I think that's got it backwards.
Yeah, I think that that's true. And I think you're actually making more work for yourself.
Oh, for sure.
Later. You're better off doing the heavy lifting in class.
Once.
That's what you're there for. I mean, it's just, yeah. I think it's when I was going through this research, preparing for this podcast, I also, had this inkling of like, okay, I get it. Maybe in class you have as much retention, but, aren't these perfect kind of class transcripts better to study off of down the line? And then these thoughtful researchers answered that question for me as I kept reading and doing research.
Fantastic. What did they say?
Well, they did a content analysis of notes, which of course showed that those who used laptops had more verbatim transcription than those who wrote notes by hand. That should not be a surprise. But the high verbatim note content was associated with lower retention of the material. So, I mean, over and over again, they just said that if your notes look perfect, that does not mean that you are keeping that information in your brain.
Right. It's almost like you've dumped it on the page and it just bypassed your brain entirely.
And then I was a psych major, so I got a little geeky as I started reading all of this stuff. But then they also said, okay, well, what if we tell people who are using a laptop that they need to synthesize the material, that they cannot transcribe what the professor is saying? So they wanted them to type notes in their own words. You would think that would solve this problem. But even with those warnings, it turns out the students using laptops still had about the same amount of verbatim content, and they were no better at synthesizing the material. So it's almost like this laptop tool poisons your ability to synthesize material, because I think we have, it's so easy to just create volume of words.
Yeah, well, I think this makes sense if you think about it in terms of, okay, say that you're doing a bunch of research and you're going to write a paper. Typically speaking, I think people are not so effective if they just sit down and start trying to type up an outline. They're typically going to be more effective if they take a piece of paper and start writing out that outline. I mean, not probably in every single case, but I think on average, it's going to be easier to do it on paper. There's some things that you just need to do on paper. Because I think your brain really is processing differently.
Yeah. The researchers also looked at that maybe down the line, students who had those laptop notes would perform better. But the research didn't support that either, because a week after class, those with the laptop notes and those with the handwritten notes were allowed to study for a test. And unfortunately for your laptop lovers, those who took hand notes still outperformed laptop participants. There were other research. There was research done at West Point where they had different sections of a class. It was all taught the same way, and they had a laptop class, a hybrid class, and a hand note taking class. And I mean, each section performed differently based on the way that the students could interact. I mean, it's kind of amazing how this little thing, like note-taking while listening to a lecture, seems to have a huge impact on your ability to perform.
Right. I mean, it is super interesting. I think if you ask most people going to law school, do you think it really matters if you take notes by hand or take notes on a laptop? I mean, I think even a lot of professors initially would have been probably doesn't really matter. As long as people are getting the information, seems like they could process it just fine. But it turns out that does not really seem to be necessarily supported by the research.
Yeah. And, this, I think, is one of those areas where it can take a lot of self-discipline to try a different way. So if you've been a laptop note taker and you get to law school, and even if you walk into a room where there are a bunch of laptops, it can take a little bit of a leap of faith and a little bit of self-discipline to say, I am going to lay down the laptop. I am not going to bring it to school with me or to class with me. And I am just going to go old school and take handwritten notes, even if other people think I'm crazy. Well, you're clearly not crazy, because the research supports that you're going to have a higher retention and may actually do better academically than somebody else who has a laptop. But it can be hard to discipline yourself to stay that focused, because we live in a very distracted world. And I think the desire to multitask is very powerful. And it can be hard to leave the laptop somewhere else or in the bag or leave your phone somewhere else. I think, What's interesting about these studies is they didn't take into account like having a cell phone on the desk or something like that, and interruptions, which I think is another type of distraction that can happen with technology. But just the idea that it's okay, that the world is not going to end if you are not connected to the internet or the phone for, even a 3-hour class, is something that takes a lot of discipline to do. It's really hard to turn off your phone sometimes.
For sure. Yeah. I decided about a week or so ago that I just was not going to ever go on Facebook or Twitter again. Maybe not forever, but I literally woke up one morning and was just like, why am I spending time on these sites? Like, I'm not deriving any pleasure from this. It's not useful to me. It's just making me stressed out. And it's been a little over a week, and it's pretty challenging not to just, there are even a couple of times where literally thoughtlessly, without even thinking about it.
Oh, yeah.
On my phone, I suddenly was looking at Facebook, and I'm like, how did that happen? I'm like, oh, I just mindlessly pushed that button because that's my habit. That's what I do. That's my distraction. And so breaking that habit is really tough. We've talked before about Deep Work by Cal Newport, which is a great book. And his argument is that as we get more and more and more distracted, having that ability to focus and really do very serious, thoughtful work is something that's incredibly valuable. So, if you are in the classroom and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm so weird, you might be the person who's going to be the one who ultimately is able to focus on that winning appellate brief or something that someone else is just literally not going to have trained themselves to do.
Yeah.
The history of law is pretty monastic.
Yeah.
It's basically people sitting in a room with a bunch of books for a very long time.
And it's not, I constantly find myself surprised at how much I want to switch between things and multitask when I know I need to do like one thing at a time. So for instance, I had a student call this morning and for somebody to study for the bar, and I always write meeting notes after a student call. But then ping, my email went off. So it was like, oh, I answered an email, and then my text message went off, and then I answered a text, and then while looking at my email from the last thing, I realized there was a discount code for something that I wanted to buy. So then I go online to buy something. And then 20 minutes later, you realize I've never taken the meeting notes and finalized them for the student. And then it took me a lot longer because I had done 5 different things between ending the meeting and doing the meeting notes, where if I had just sat down for 5 minutes, I could have probably cranked out the meeting notes because they were fresh in my mind. And it would have been done with, but it's very hard because we do live in this distracted world with all these alerts and these notifications, and we're not working at our best.
Right. I think that's a good point, because I'm guessing that during your meeting with the student, you were probably taking notes by hand. Is that accurate?
Not today, but usually I do.
Right. Well, oftentimes if I have a call with someone, for example, what I'll often do is take some notes by hand, and then I'll put them in some sort of electronic format. But it's definitely, it's very, very tempting not to do that as soon as you finish whatever the meeting is, but it definitely makes it a lot harder. And I think this is this has relevance to the note taking in class, because I think one of the things people are concerned about in class is, well, okay, say I take these notes by hand, but then what? Am I going to retype them all? I've talked to people who take their notes by hand and then they go retype them verbatim, which I would argue is really not that different from just typing them verbatim to begin with. The whole point is you need to be processing at all the steps along the way.
Right.
So, I think there's definitely value in backing these up in some sort of analog fashion, whether it's taking pictures of them or scanning them or whatever. Obviously, you don't want to lose them.
Right.
But, thinking through the next step for people, how they get this information out of their notes and into a usable format, I think is also valuable.
Yeah, I think that's true. And interestingly enough, the only reason I did not take notes by hand today was because we were interacting using an online tool and working on the computer together. And but even then, my notes during our call are very cryptic. All I need is something to refresh my recollection so I can write out thoughtful comments. And so, I'm not going to sit there and take transcript notes of a call because if I'm truly engaged, I should retain enough information that I can write up notes after a 30-minute call. One would hope, just in the same way that if you're truly engaged in class, you should be able to, be able to recall what some of your class notes were covering and what the discussion was covering. And I think, students feel so scared that they might miss the secret that was told in class that they didn't put down in their notes, or that their notes might get confusing. But that's what things like office hours are for. That's what things like comparing your notes to your friend in class can be for. Like, there are ways to make sure that you're filling in any gaps.
Yeah, for sure. This is kind of your starting point.
Right. These are just class notes. These are just notes based on a lecture. So if you, when you're doing your deep work, go back to review some lecture notes and are scratching your head because it doesn't make sense, then you go to office hours and you can tell your professor, I was reviewing my class notes and it seems that you laid out that it was a 3-pronged test, but then I was going back through the cases and that doesn't seem to be what was in the case. Did I take my notes incorrectly, or is there a more modern rule? And your professor's not going to be like, you should have taken better notes. Like, your professor's probably going to walk it through and be happy that you didn't come in with a transcript of his class. I think
right. And I'm also sure that I typed up all kinds of incorrect information.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, I think it's a lot about kind of freeing yourself from this assumption that we have to be tied to technology to do the best work we can possible. And I think that's
oftentimes that's the opposite of reality.
Exactly. It is.
And the good news is there actually are kind of systematic ways to take notes by hand that can be super effective. So I think we have a post on the website about the Cornell note-taking method.
Yep.
And our favorite notebooks, the Circa notebooks that you can actually get. They're kind of designed for that. So there, in a very brief nutshell, is I think you have a column on the left, and then you have like your main note-taking section, and then you have a section at the bottom. And so each one of those has a purpose. So I think one of them you take like highlights, and one of them you just take notes, and then one of them you ask like follow-up questions and things you're confused about, whatever it is. Read the post. But the point being, you're not just dumping everything on a legal pad at that point. Like, it's an actual system,
right?
That can be very effective for people.
Yeah. The other thing about the Circa notebooks that we like is, if you've never used them or whatever version of them, I know like Staples has a version. There are other versions floating out there, but you can easily move pages around, which I think is also very powerful, because if you've got a notebook and you have class notes, you can, you can move your brief to the beginning of the class notes, or you can just reorganize things, because I think that's one thing that people struggle with taking notes by hand, is if you're taking them in, let's say, a spiral notebook, you can't move things around, or people don't want to carry binders because they're too heavy, where something like the Circa notebook or that style gives you a lot of flexibility without having to abandon the paper or handwriting.
Yeah, and when it comes time to put your outline or study aid together or whatever it is you're studying, you can actually take everything out and kind of spread it out and get an overview, just in the way that if you printed out your class notes, which I would often do, and like went through and highlighted them so I could look at them all at once, you can do the same thing on paper. So, it doesn't just have to be like, oh, I'm going to go in with a legal pad and write stuff down. Like, there actually are pretty sophisticated ways to use analog options that give you a lot of flexibility.
Yep. All right, so we've already started talking about it a little bit, but, major issues with laptops, I think, beyond the lack of retention, is the distraction. We've been talking about this, the internet.
Oh, yeah.
It's huge. One study that was done actually with law school students showed that 90% of laptop users engaged in online activities unrelated to coursework for at least 5 minutes, and roughly 60% were distracted for half of the class.
That's not surprising.
It's not
if I think
surprising.
Back to my law school days.
Yeah.
People would be doing all kinds of stuff, shopping online, chat rooms,
reading
sometimes
news.
Dating sites, reading the news. Yeah. Oh, I definitely caught up on my New York Times in class. Definitely.
Yeah.
All sorts of different things. Checking email. Now you can be slacking with your study group or whatever. It's very hard not to be doing these things.
Yep. mean, back in the day, my first year of law school, my school didn't have Wi-Fi yet. That makes me feel really
Whoa.
old. I know. They got
How
Wi-Fi.
did you survive?
Well, it was Wi-Fi in the classrooms came, I think, my 2L year. But it was a big deal because it was almost a blessing in disguise because we had to, like, take out the Ethernet cord and plug in the computer. I mean,
we still had
its own internet plug. But you kind of had to, like, out yourself that you were going to be distracted in class because there was no other reason to plug your computer into the internet.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I mean, I think the distraction is bad for the person doing it, and it's also bad for everyone around you.
Yes, and they actually, in my nerdy research I did today, they've actually done research that laptop use by one student can actually harm other students around them, and that the multitasking of the laptop is a significant distraction to both the users and people, even those who may be handwriting around that student. And I thought that was interesting because but a chunk of law school professors are banning laptops and technology in their classrooms. Mm-hmm. And at first, you kind of, I think, err on the side of, hey, aren't we all adults? And shouldn't we be able to make these choices for ourselves? But when research is supporting that the laptop use is distracting to other students, even making those their own choice to not use technology, maybe the professors have a point.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this, too, can depend on where you end up sitting. So if you are someone who knows you're distracted by these type of things, I think everyone's distracted, but some people are probably more sensitive. It makes sense to think about, do you want to sit in the front row? Do you want to sit, where you're not going to be as distracted? I mean, certainly, right. I don't know. I mean, I definitely remember reading over people's shoulders and getting really into whatever they were doing and just being like, oh, wow, okay, I just totally missed the last 5 minutes. I mean, I think the downside of a professor deciding to do this, is really that there's certain students who need to use a laptop. If you have some sort of learning disability or physical issue that makes you, at one point, I had actually, this would have meant I couldn't use my laptop, but, I cut my finger, so I guess I would have had to handwrite. But assume that for some reason I did something differently and had to use the laptop. So I think there's an issue there around it kind of outing people who maybe have accommodations or something like that. So I think that, I think it's a tricky question to just put a total ban on them, although I can understand the impetus. I wouldn't necessarily want to have to make that choice as a professor.
Right. I think it is tough. If you are a student who has a disability and the laptop is going to be something that you want to consider using, you can also talk to disability services and see if there are any other options. So at my law school, there were designated note takers who would share their notes with students with disabilities anonymously. And that allowed the students with the disabilities to not have to worry as much about tracking the notes in class perfectly because they knew they were going to get, reputable notes from another student. And so you never know what might be the options to kind of remove some of this worry or stress around the laptop use or lack of laptop use. And it may actually be better for you if you don't have to try to physically take all of these notes while trying to comprehend what's going on in class. So I guess there are often more options than you might think to explore, but you got to go ask early when you get back to school to see if, there are some accommodations that could make even this note-taking issue easier for you.
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the individual. If you are someone who, for whatever reason, definitely feels like you absolutely need to have a laptop and your professor wants to ban them, I think a fair question is like, okay, can I switch to a different professor where this is not going to be an issue?
Right.
Because I think it is, it's awkward if you're one or the only person or one of a couple of people who are taking notes and everyone else wants to be using their laptop and they can't, and they're, it's just not a great scenario. So if your professor is going to do that, I think that's a valid question.
Yeah. And just because it might be quote unquote easier for you to take those notes on the laptop, depending on your disability, depending on how you process information, don't just assume that the laptop's actually going to make it better. Because, for instance, if you're a student with ADHD, which is a common learning disability that gets accommodations in law school that we see a lot of, it might seem like, well, but if I can take all these notes, then even if I'm distracted in class, I can go back and reference these really comprehensive notes. You have to balance that with the amount of distraction that comes and the fact that you're not forcing your mind to try and process the information in class. So, for some students in that situation, I might recommend go ahead and try taking notes by hand and seeing if you can get a friend to also share their notes with you. So you could compare and see if you missed anything, or find somebody in your study group that you can review your class notes with afterwards, or something along those lines, because giving up all the benefits for handwriting is often not worth it, just for this idea that you could track more information.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think you have to sometimes push against what seems like the easiest approach and think about, okay, is this really getting me to where I need to be? And then really try it out. I mean, one thing I sometimes hear is people like, well, I couldn't take notes by hand because my handwriting is just so bad.
Yeah.
What do you do with that?
Well, unless you cannot read your own handwriting at all, I think you
in which case you might want to work on your penmanship.
Yeah, I know. But it's like even people with not great handwriting can usually read their own handwriting. It's that someone else might not be able to read it.
Yeah, I had someone tell me he couldn't read his handwriting. And I was like, well, maybe you should just write more slowly and write better.
And maybe that is a candidate for somebody maybe retyping something later if they are worried they're not going to be able to remember what they wrote. But I think for the majority of people, your penmanship is probably just fine to go ahead and try and take notes by hand.
Yeah, and again, like if you're trying to write really, really quickly and you're basically trying to transcribe, well, just write less.
Yeah. Think more, write less.
I think that should be our motto. Think more, write less.
Exactly. And turns out all of the scientific studies seem to support that. So it comes with some valuable resources, and I've linked to some of the articles and information about these studies. So if you too, like me, were a psych major in college and get excited about this kind of stuff, you can go read these studies on one of your breaks as well. But don't read it during class, because that would be a bad distraction.
Well, and I think, you can also do things like you go to class, you take notes by hand, and then you take 10 or 15 minutes afterwards to find your laptop and then type up, the key points you want to remember. I think that could actually be a very effective way of sort of combining these two things.
Yeah. And that maybe for someone who says they can't remember read what's in their handwriting is like a middle ground.
Yeah, I mean, you can probably remember from an hour ago.
Right. If you were paying attention. If you were reading the New York Times or posting on Facebook about all of the political upheaval that's going on in the world, you may not remember what happened in class, and that could be problematic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So what are our kind of recommendations? Well, try taking notes by hand. It might sound scary, might sound like something that you don't want to do, but just try it. Just try it for like a week. See what happens.
You can even try like one class.
Yeah, just one class, but just try what happens. Learn about different note-taking systems. We mentioned the Cornell method, which we'll link to in the show notes. We've talked about Circa notebooks, but try out some different processes using, you can even use different colored pens. I know, Allison, you're such a big fan of like drawings. I think one of the benefits of doing things by hands is you can kind of, link to things and do circles and mind maps.
You could even make like a little flow chart right on the fly. I mean, amazing.
Yeah. So you have kind of this ability to create notes outside the box, which I think is also very helpful. But explore some of the note-taking systems. If you haven't started law school yet, maybe you can read up on some of these so you can, in a week, try a few different ones and see which one really works for you, because not everybody's going to think and process the same way. And just be willing and open to try it. Even if you love your laptop, can't get enough of it, love your iPad, love your whatever, just give it a try. You're not going to lose anything. Nothing bad's going to happen.
If you go to class for a week and you take notes by hand and then you decide you absolutely can't do it, well, you'll probably be okay.
It's kind of like turning off your phone for an hour. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay.
Yeah, you'll survive.
You'll survive. All right. Well, with that, I think we're about out of time. You can find all our episodes, including archives by episode number and by topic, at lawschooltoolbox.com/podcast if you're interested in catching up on other episodes. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.